Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Grand Rounds. Thank you all for coming. I will turn it over to Dr. Bierkens to introduce our speaker today.
Hey, everyone. Good morning and welcome to Grand Rounds. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christina Fuller, an associate professor at the University of Georgia College of Engineering. Dr. Fuller is an environmental health scientist dedicated to the research that investigates relevant questions concerning environmental exposures and impacts. Her research aligns three related areas. 1, the fate and transport of air pollution. 2, disproportionate environmental burdens on marginalized populations. And 3, novel solutions to those pollution exposures. Dr. Fuller is dedicated to community engagement and research and the democratization of data that promotes environmental equity. Her work has been funded by the National Institute of Health, the Centers for Disease Control, and the JPB Foundation. She is co-editor of the book Ambient Combustion Ultrafine Particles in Health that summarizes the issue of ambient ultrafine particles and their health effects. Dr. Fuller is also a member of the EPA Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Fuller today.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here to speak with all of you. I have some connections with New York City. I actually lived in New York City for a few years after working first in my hometown of Chicago. And when I was in New York, I took my environmental engineering degree and worked with several community-based organizations there around different issues related to their exposures and also health. So exposures to lead, exposures to air pollution, disproportionate locations of different industrial facilities. And that really impressed upon me the importance of population health. And so I went back to graduate school after that time at the Harvard School of Public Health to learn how to do research around those areas that would really inform those conversations and answer questions that are really important for population health. So in terms of my development and the work that I'm doing right now is very informed by my work in New York City. So today I'm going to speak about air pollution and its effect on health. And it's a very broad-reaching topic, and I'm going to focus my presentation on two different parts. So pretty much the first part is going to be concentrations and disparities. And then the second part of my presentation will be looking at the health effects. And there's going to be plenty of time for questions because I find in these formats, it's really important to have time to answer questions that really help inform what people are concerned about. So I'd like to begin here with a focus on, let's see if I can get this to go away. Hopefully that will go away soon. So there are some specific needs that we have for our basic survival. So we need to have a certain amount of water, we need to breathe air, and we need to have food. So you can just think upon this for a few minutes of what amount that we need of each one of these and the maximum deprivation as well. So just think about that a moment. You know, how much do you eat in a day? How much water do you drink? And how much air do you breathe? So let me remove this box. And it really exposes the importance of air in terms of our basic survival. So if you compare these three, we breathe the most air because we are doing it constantly. And then we can only go without it for just a few minutes. So this is really important in terms of how important it is to have clean air to breathe. And air pollution is a very wide-ranging topic. So what's important here is that there are actually over 80,000 chemicals that are registered with the EPA for some kind of use, and many of those thousands of chemicals are going to get into the air. So outdoor air pollution can include any of these. And there's benzene, there's carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, ozone, and all of these different chemicals that can be present in outdoor air. And that's one category that we are thinking about with regards to air pollution, those which are in the outdoor environments. Another area of air pollution that is very important, especially if we're talking about the global burden of disease, is going to be household air pollution. And that is air pollution that is generated from the use of different fuels for cooking, for heating, and for other indoor uses. And household air pollution is also a very large component of the global burden of disease, but I won't discuss it too much in this presentation. In addition to having those outdoor air pollutants and those chemicals, we also have things such as biologicals, such as pet dander and mold spores, which can be irritants and can also be really important for public health if we're thinking about indoor concentrations and triggers for things such as asthma. So the outdoor and the indoor environment are both very important. And there are many sources of air pollution in the urban environment as well. So one that you would probably think of originally is like, here's a smokestack at a power company and it's belching out all of these chemicals and volatile chemicals there. So one of the major sources of air pollution that we're concerned about is from industry and also the generation of electricity, especially oil and gas. So those fossil fuels are very polluting and have chemicals and particulates that, when released into the air, are associated with adverse health outcomes. In addition, we have the burning of fossil fuels, either diesel or gasoline, in our cars and trucks that we use on a daily basis, as well as for transportation of our goods across the country. I would also include in this category rail transport as well, which is mostly diesel engines, and a large proportion of our goods are transported by rail as well. Then we also have natural phenomena such as sandstorms that can bring dust from Africa and then also from Asia all the way to the United States. And these sandstorms are a weather phenomenon, and they are changing somewhat with climate change. Another contributor to air pollution that is gaining more importance is wildfires. And so wildfires is going to be burning of different woods. And this picture actually is from the fires a few years ago when they were burning right next to Los Angeles. And this has been a significant problem in the West, also in Australia and other parts of the world, and is expected to increase in severity. And also the fire season has been lengthening as well. So this is an issue of growing concern in the future. And so when you have wildfire burnings, you're going to have some of the same chemicals that you have in particulates when you're burning some of the other fossil fuels as well, because these are biological systems. So the World Health Organization estimates that 99% of people across the globe breathe pollution that's above its guidelines, which are 5 micrograms per meter cubed. And these concentrations are not the same across the globe, as I've illustrated here in this WHO figure. So this is data, annual mean concentrations of particulate matter in urban areas, and this is data from 2014. So particulate matter is a specific type of air pollutant that I'm going to describe in more detail in a couple of slides. But what I want you to really get from this figure is if you look on the left-hand side and you see the legend there, the lightest color violet is less than 10 micrograms per meter cubed, and then the darkest color purple is less than 35. And there's a significant amount of variation, as you can see. And the darkest colors are in developing countries, and that's for multiple reasons. So if we want to bring it in a little bit closer to home and look at specific cities, since we're focusing in this talk on urban areas, air pollution has been shown to be poor in many different cities across the globe. And some of these you can probably guess. On the top left, you see that that is Paris with the Eiffel Tower there. And high air pollution days can happen when under cool conditions, when pollutants are less able to dissipate. So depending on the location, you can have the highest concentrations in the wintertime for many pollutants. If anyone knows what's on the upper right, that is Mexico City on a very smoggy day. So there can also be high concentrations when you have a city that's at a relatively high elevation, such as Mexico City, which is in a bowl because it's ringed by mountains. And so that many times creates an inversion layer. So you have warm air that is above the cooler air, and therefore it has a lid, as you would say, on top of the city, and it's makes the air very stagnant and doesn't move around. So it really traps the concentrations and the pollution close to the city, and it's not able to move. On the bottom left here, we have Delhi. And there's been high concentrations in Delhi growing over recent years for multiple reasons. Under warm conditions, when you have precursor chemicals, they can react with sunlight and create smog and ozone concentrations. You can also have different types of crop burning as well, which increases the sources from that, and traffic pollution as well. And older cars pollute a lot more than newer cars. So in different cities where you have the vehicles are mostly older, you're going to be generating a whole lot more emissions than when they are newer vehicles. And then I'm sure everyone knows the picture on the right. So that is New York City. And so New York City is not exempt from having high pollution days as well. And again, depending on the local conditions and the weather and the generation from emissions, especially from traffic. So those are cities from across the globe. And also looking more closely at the United States, and this is just a stylized, representation, but just like there's variation between countries, there's also variation within countries, and that depends on the local conditions and sources. So overall, a country may be in compliance with guidelines from the World Health Organizations, or, within compliance if you think overall for your US EPA. However, within the country, you will have very large disparities in concentrations, and that's for several different reasons, which we'll get into more. The US EPA has standards from the Clean Air Act. And so the Clean Air Act regulates the amount of 6 pollutants in outdoor air through the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or the NAAQS. So you're thinking about there may be potentially 80,000 different chemicals in the air, and we're able to regulate 6 of them. And they're listed here: carbon monoxide, lead, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, particle pollution, and also sulfur dioxide. So we have primary and secondary standards for each one of these NACs, and we have specific levels that need to be met by large metropolitan areas. And the US EPA mandates that each of these large cities and regions have its own monitoring systems that are used for compliance purposes. And if a city is out of compliance with these regulations, then they have to create a plan to lower the concentrations. And I have in a few slides actually that shows that since the enactment of the Clean Air Act, concentrations of air pollution overall in the United States have really been reduced. So this has been, quite successful in reducing concentrations overall, but there's also a good amount of variation and disparities. And it's also important to note that these standards are requisite for a certain level of protection of public health, but it's not necessarily saying that this is a specific safe level, but it is for the protection of public health as listed in the Clean Air Act. So an area of research where I spend the most of my time is looking at TRAP. So that is traffic-related air pollution. And if you break these down into a few categories, you'll find sulfates, you'll find elemental carbons, that's the actual solid particles of carbon. You'll find carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, volatile organic chemicals, those are all gases. And those come directly out of the tailpipe. And then, as I mentioned previously, with some of these volatile organic carbons, in the presence of sunlight and high temperatures, you can get secondary pollutants such as ozone. And you can also get the generation of particulate matter as well, secondarily. But if you look at particulate matter, that has been an area, a pollutant that has been studied for a long time. And we have a good amount of data looking at its exposures, distributions over space and time, and also relationship with health outcomes. So I'm going to talk more about what particulate matter is and then how it's distributed. I can get this to. Okay. So particulate matter are solid or liquid phase particles that are suspended in a gas, and that gas being air. And the size of the particle is very important because it will determine how far that particle will travel, how it may clump together with other particles, and also how it will interact with the body as well. So with regards to regulations, we have PM10 and PM2.5. And so those are particles that are less than 2.5 microns in diameter or less than 10 microns in diameter. And looking here at the picture, you can see that they are not all spherical. So they can be different shapes. They can look like crystals. They can look like rods. They can be different types of mold spores, even some different nanoparticles as well. And there's concerns about those in the indoor environments, different types of molds as well. Those are all in the category of particulate matter. So chemical composition is very important. And also this can be liquid droplets as well. And those may have some different effects on the body. And these are results of different burning of fossil fuels, dust, even the breakdown of tires and wear can create particles, and also natural ones as well, pollens and also dust. So as I said, particulate matter is described by its size. And this figure just shows just how small they are. So you have fine beach sand, which is about 90 microns in diameter here. And then if you were to, and then you look, here is a strand of hair. And PM10 is going to be this size right here. So too small to see. PM 2.5 is even smaller. You can put 4 of those across a PM10 particle. And then the smallest class is ultrafine particles, and those are less than 0.1 microns in diameter. So these are really too small to see, too small to smell, but they can be distinguished and have their own properties and their own concentrations because of their size. And here's an example of that. So what this shows is the cross section of a highway. And here you have the 0 is the middle of the highway, and measuring upwind 300 meters, which is about 3 blocks, and then downwind about 3 blocks as well. And so this is cross sections and taking the different types of pollutants and seeing how much they vary. So if we look at PM 2.5, there's not much of a difference between the relative concentrations here and the middle of the road where you have the highest concentrations. But if you look at smaller particles, ultrafine particles, black carbon, and then some gases like carbon monoxide, you can see that they have a really high concentration very close to the highway or to the road, and then it drops off very quickly afterwards. So what this means is that there can be very high concentrations of some of these pollutants close to roadways, which you will not be able to be captured if you have a monitor that's kind of away from a road in the city. So local monitoring is the only way to capture these hotspots of concentrations that can affect people's health. This is an example, again, of some intercity variation in air pollution. Again, this is for PM 2.5, which there is some difference, but not as much as some other pollutants. And so here, this is the downtown connectors when we have 2 of our major highways running together. And this is another major highway going this way. So higher concentrations are in red, and then lower concentrations are in green. So you can see these hot spots are going to be just, a few 5-6 blocks from the roadways. So people who live here, who work here, they will be exposed to higher concentrations than those people that are further away. So there's been a great deal of research on the physical determinants of air pollution as they pertain to the position of sources within the built environment, different emission levels, and also meteorology. However, in addition to that, there are also upstream conditions that control where sources are located, what they release, and who lives close by to those. So it's been identified through many studies that poor and minority communities are closer to these sources on average. And that's for multiple reasons. One reason is the concentration of industry in lower income communities because it's cheaper for them to operate. Also have different zoning practices, which depends on cities and how cities grow over time, how zoning can change, and many times leaving industry or putting industry in different areas of residences. And also specific practices such as redlining that adversely impact Black and other communities of color, putting them at greater proximity to sources. And I have an example from a study shortly. And even the federal highway system, which was laid out in a manner that destroyed a lot of very viable minority communities. So these associations are very persistent, and decisions in the past very much predict concentrations today, but they can also be dynamic as you have changes in cities happening in former industrial locations or switched to residential in urban areas. So it was really a very, overall, there's a picture, but in individual cities, you may have changes happening very quickly, which may change those at-risk communities. And similar patterns in air pollution exposure across cities have occurred in the United States and also across the world. And one of the reasons actually started with a person from New York City. And so if any of you have found this book, which is extremely thick, it's about this thick, this book, it's called The Power Broker, Robert Moses and the Fall of New York. And so this is a biography of Robert Moses, and it focuses on the creation and use of power in local and state politics, as witnessed through Moses's use of unelected positions to design and implement dozens of highways and bridges that all of you are familiar with, and also many parks as well, and sometimes at the great cost of the communities that they really didn't serve. So, as summarized in this book, Moses created a lot of beautiful parks that served the wealthy New Yorkers, but at the same time, deliberately excluded Blacks and Latinos from these parklands and ability to get to these recreational areas by making sure that there was not transportation, public transportation to these parks. Also, there was a lot of demolishing of working class neighborhoods to build highways and bridges to allow for the fast transport out to suburbs. And it really destroyed a lot of the cultural fabric and increasing environmental exposures for poor and for people of color. And unfortunately, this matter of really creating highways and cities was replicated in other cities across the country. And there are many cities now that are reclaiming some of those lands and making highways into regular open access roads and even parkland in different cities. So let's touch a little bit about redlining. And so this is from a paper that came out very recently, looking at air pollution disparities and historically redlined areas. And what you can see here is that they looked at over 200 maps, redline maps drawn in the 1930s. And so for those of you who are not familiar with redlining, and so this was done to make loans for housing back in the 1930s, created by a government agency, and they graded them from A to D. And white wealthy areas were A, and then Black areas were D, and then you had a few different ones in between. So what you see here is that air pollution in 2010 is associated with the 1930s redlining grade. And if you compare from those that were A to those that are D, there's a statistically significant increase in air pollution now based on those redline areas. And that's going to be based on those decisions that were made in the areas that were D. You did not have a lot of investments. You had industries that would come there and were permitted to site there. Lots of transportation put in those areas as well. And so those built environment decisions have now resulted in increases in concentrations. And so also looking at disproportionate exposures, again, here we're looking at separating things by the whole population and then by race. And so on the left-hand side in panel A, you see the average PM 2.5 concentrations between 2000 and 2015. And overall, been decreases in concentrations, which is a very much an improvement. And then looking at B, how that's separated out by race. And see the lowest are in white populations, with those areas that are predominantly whites and Native Americans are lower. And then you have Hispanic, Asian, and Black that are at higher concentrations. So I'm going to transition now to looking and talking more about the health impacts and vulnerability. So I wanted to start this off because this work is talking about population health, but it is important for individuals. And, you know, fairly recently, air pollution has been actually brought into the discourse and the understanding of individual results from individual people. So this is this happened in London. So a little girl, Ella Kisi Deborah, she died in February 2013 from acute respiratory failure. She had severe asthma. And the coroner actually said that she died of asthma contributed to by exposure to excessive air pollution. And this is not anything that had happened before in terms of actually listing air pollution as being important in the cause of someone's death before. So this is really a change in this. And just to, you know, just put a face on this is that, you know, especially for children and high asthma, it's really important and a really big concern. So if you're looking at the whole global burden of disease, and so the global burden of disease is an estimate of disease and mortality across the whole globe based on several risk factors and looking at different outcomes. And so it's estimated that 6.7 million deaths annually are associated with outdoor and indoor air pollution. 4.2 million excess deaths associated worldwide, and 103.1 dailies or disability adjusted life years, which is a metric designed to capture both mortality and morbidity from disease. And air pollution is one of the greatest environmental risk factors to health. And by reducing air pollution levels, countries can reduce the burden of disease from stroke, heart disease, lung cancer, chronic and acute respiratory diseases, and asthma. And here in the figure, they have this broken down by some of the main WHO categories. And in the next slide, I have even some more specifics on that. I think it's important to also note that about 91% of those premature deaths occurred in low and middle income countries, and the greatest number in WHO Southeast Asia and Western Pacific regions. Okay, so in this estimate of a global burden of disease, air pollution is given as the 5th highest cause of mortality worldwide. And what's shown in this figure is ambient PM 2.5 concentration burden. And then they show the sectors, the fuel and disease contributions for the global average. for the top 9 countries. And we can take out a few of these to look at. So we have the United States here with an estimated 47,000 deaths and an overall PM 2.5 concentration of 7.8. And then we can contrast that to China with overall about 49.8 micrograms per meter cubed, which is way, way above the US EPA standards, as well as World Health Organization standards, an estimated 1.387 million deaths. And also countries such as India here, which again had really high concentrations in several cities, 867,000 deaths, and a really astronomical 80.2 micrograms per meter cubed concentration of PM 2.5. So just to talk a little bit about focusing on particulate matter and showing the deposition of particulate matter in the airways, and showing that they have done measurements looking at where in these different regions is their deposition, and then the size of the particles. So you see way down here in the alveolar region, they have estimated that a lot of the ultrafine particles actually reach down that low, but not as much for the larger particles. Those are mostly captured up here in the upper airways. So they do get very down deep into the lungs. So again, a large proportion of global burden of disease from air pollution is due to illness and death of children under 5 due to respiratory infections and pneumonia as well. And it's definitely a significant burden, as well as in higher income countries, like in the US, for certain marginalized communities. So epidemiological studies have found social associations and a causal association with asthma, also linkages to lung cancer, COPD, and instances of coughing and wheezing in children. Cardiovascular as well, which is linked to systemic inflammation. So there have been found to be associations with myocardial infarction, atherosclerosis, even high blood pressure as well. Also, effects on the reproductive system. There have been some very good studies in New York looking at air pollution in preterm birth, finding associations there, also with low birth weight, and with the brain and central nervous system as well, associations with stroke, and some studies finding some associations with autism as well. Some emerging impacts of particulate matter and ultrafine particle exposures and health are intestinal effects that we are learning more and more about how important the gut flora is to overall health, and also with mental health outcomes as well. So those areas of epidemiological research are growing. As well as susceptibility to air pollution too. There's evidence from multiple studies that the effects of air pollution on health can be worse based on different comorbidities, such as if you have existing respiratory disease or cardiovascular disease or are overweight or obese. Also, even some evidence of looking at of having air pollution have more of an effect due to chronic stress, and that wear and tear on the body really priming the system to be more highly affected by air pollution. So further examination of these are yielding insight into these different susceptibilities, as well as opportunities for interventions. And these specifically are from a paper that I wrote looking at chronic stress exposures and C-reactive protein and systolic blood pressure, and finding some variation there at high levels of those stressors among women in a cohort. So I wanted to, in these last couple of slides, to talk about a few cases that I think are really important for doctors to know about, for physicians, is to know about, the effects near roadways, which I talked a little bit about already. But those first research looking at air pollution near roadways did not measure concentrations. They just looked at distance to highway and prevalence of different health outcomes. And they found associations with prevalence of asthma, lung cancer, and cardiovascular disease, just based on how far the populations lived from the highway. And it's estimated that about 96 million people live within 303 blocks, or about 300 meters of highways or busy roadways. So that's a pretty large population that is potentially exposed to these hotspots. Also, there are specific concerns about air toxics. Example is Cancer Alley. So that's the 85-mile stretch of the lower Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, where they have lots of petrochemical companies and other industrial facilities, plastics plants, oil refineries, and other chemical facilities. And they have found increases, even double the risk of some cancers in these communities that live in Cancer Alley. A specific community called St. James Parish has been involved in several studies, and as well has been a center of environmental justice efforts as well, due to the fact this very small community, predominantly Black parish, has so many chemical companies located there, and are getting even more located there, because as you have one chemical facility, it's easier for other chemical companies to come in and get permits based on there already being some there. Another important issue has been the increase in the severity and hotter wildfires. These are just some pictures from back in 2017. This is a snapshot of all the fires that were burning in California, all the damage that has been done, and people posting on social media of the issues that they're having with their breathing, and with other health issues based on breathing all of this smoke in from these wildfires. So the wildfire season is expected to get longer with more hotter wildfires. So this is going to be an increasing issue. There's also been studies looking at wildfire exposures and emergency room visits for asthma and other health effects, and have found, of course, associations between the presence of those fires and people breathing in those air pollutants and having these short-term effects, and also developing chronic disease as well. A last one, let's see if this video will show, is fracking as well, which is a concern because fracking is, for those of you who are not familiar, is when you have wells that are drilled in areas in order to extract the natural gas by pumping in a lot of water with different kinds of chemicals, acids, salts. And most of those chemicals are proprietary, so they are not reported and do not know the risks from these. But what has been sampled in the air has been a lot of very harmful toxics. And on occasion, they do catch on fire. And this is one that burned for about a month. And there being health effects from these types of short-term exposures as well. So there, in the studies that have been done thus far, there have been associations found with occupational lung cancer and silicosis, occupational radiation exposures, again, based on the chemicals that are in these proprietary formulas, nosebleeds and asthma attacks, and different types of respiratory diseases, and some adverse birth outcomes. So this is also an emerging area of concern. So for my conclusions, air pollution is a ubiquitous exposure with a great deal of variation due to multiple reasons. It can be natural variation. It can be based on the siting of facilities, local meteorology. And so it's important to recognize that air pollution can make a big difference in health. The global burden of disease is very large, and we do have those impacts here in the United States as well. Exposure is distributed unevenly due to historical discrimination, current emissions, and natural variation over space and time. And that this is a risk factor that's not individually controlled or easily modifiable. But it would take larger efforts in order to reduce concentrations overall. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Fuller. That was a great overview. We do have a couple questions in the chat already, which I can read for everyone and get us started. Please feel free to put more questions in the chat. I'll start by the comment that's in here first as a comment and question. Also, the beautiful stone bridges over Long Island highways were designed by Moses to be too low for buses to pass so that poor people who might have used buses to get to the beaches could not pass. And I think that's a narrative that we've been hearing around.
Yes.
Here. Yes. The question is that goes with this is which mask would protect us from the pollutants that you're describing?
Which type of mask?
Masks, yes.
Oh, yes. So that's a really good question. So let's see. So let me get my things together. So I'm thinking about the size. So so the N95 masks are pretty good with filtering out some of the PM 2.5 particles down to that size. But the particles that are lower than that are not going to be removed by any of our masks that we have currently kind of available on the market. But some of those N95s will take out some of the PM 2.5 particles.
Gotcha. I was as a corollary to that, I was thinking, has anyone yet done any research around the periods of time when we were wearing masks all the time versus not? Has anyone started to look at that?
I don't know about that, but that would be very interesting. That would be very interesting.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
It's from Dr. Is this Dr. Cramp? Yeah, Dr. Cramp. Can you speak to the mechanisms of how air pollutants cause cardiac disease?
Yeah. So there's a few that the epidemiological studies have been looking at. And so some are changes to the autonomic nervous system. And there have been associations found with changes in like heart rate variability. But the majority of the research seems to find the mechanism to be systemic inflammation. And those subsequent cascades causing increases in things like C-reactive protein, IL-6, and those being associated with atherosclerosis and myocardial infarction and things like that. Also, possibly the direct interaction of particles, very small particles with actually the tissues as well, is possible. But it seems to be the mechanism through systemic inflammation. Seems to be predominant.
Thank you. Probably through entrance through the lungs, I would guess, and then
yes,
into the systemic circulation and then to the heart. Yes, I'm a pulmonologist, but I was asking a question about heart for this particular.
I know, but the entry point is still through the through the respiratory system.
Absolutely. No, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Everything goes back to the lungs, Dr. Kraft, right?
It does. It's so true. It's so true.
There's another question, Dr. Fuller. Do home ionic air purifiers reduce exposure in higher concentration areas?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's been a little research on that, and it does, again, the larger particles, and we're talking about PM10 particles, and some of the PM2.5, some of the air purifiers do reduce those concentrations. The smaller particles, those are not able to really be removed by those, but some of the larger ones, yes.
Great. Let me see here. From Dr. Bierkens, are there any local efforts that are currently underway to lower air pollution concentrations in big cities in the U.S. that we as physicians could potentially contribute to?
That's a good question. That's an excellent question. So there's lots.
That's why he's our chief resident, Dr. Fuller.
So there's lots. I mean, first of all, I mean, there are efforts to prevent moving forward, since we know that there's a historical basis of putting polluting facilities in certain locations, to prevent certain areas, like areas near schools, to be, cited for any kind of industrial facilities, or even the siting of new schools near roadways. They do have in law in California, you can't site a new school within 500 feet of a highway. That's the only place that I know that has anything like that. But there's also efforts, since we spend a lot, this is a whole nother talk that I could talk about, but there's also efforts in terms of cleaning the indoor air, so getting HEPA filtration systems in to schools, since we spend most of our time indoors. So to reduce the infiltration of that outdoor pollution indoors by using HEPA filtration, and also even those standing types of air purifiers as well. And in addition, an area of research that I am looking at trees, and how trees can improve air quality as well. So planting more trees in different locations, and also trying to make sure that we keep trees as well. So there's a couple of different ways kind of to be involved and to support those nonprofits that are engaged with that type of work as well.
Great. There's a question about whether medical gases affects pollution, has an effect on pollution.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Medical gas that's actually being used, I mean, it would depend on the gas. And if it's used in indoor environments, it would be, that can be of concern if you have concentration building up in indoor environments. I know that there are concerns about the sterilization of medical equipment using specific chemicals. And so those communities that are next to sterilization facilities, there have been some studies looking at any possible adverse effects from those. But in the indoor environments, being concerned about if there's any high concentrations of any gases, because even high concentrations of CO2 indoors is going to be harmful, or carbon monoxide and other things.
Great. And we have an intriguing question from Dr. Cespedes. Is there any data on pollution levels and health outcomes in gentrified neighborhood residents where the surrounding infrastructure may not have significantly changed?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, the example I have, there's not been a lot of work on that. But in some work that I've done in Boston, looking at different areas of the city. So Based on the transportation and the housing, you have most of your really high income housing, which is downtown, actually close to the roadways. And so that's where we find the highest concentrations. So therefore, if there may be high income people moving into an area that's close to sources such as transportation, there can be higher concentrations and higher exposures for them. However, that can be tempered if you have a very good housing with good filtration that's going to be filtering out any of that harmful pollution into the indoor environment, versus if you have low quality housing where if you don't have air conditioning, you got to open your windows and you're right next to the highway, is going to be very different. Mm-hmm.
Is there a time frame for these exposures and how long it takes to develop disease? Has that been looked at?
Yes. So there are long-term studies where they've looked at chronic exposures over years and have found associations with the development of asthma in children. And this is, asthma that's showing up while they're still a child, and also looking at cardiovascular disease as well. So they're looking at multiple years of exposure. And then with some of the studies looking at emergency room visits, there's our short-term effects on myocardial infarction as well. When you have increases in associations, you have increases in myocardial infarctions the next day or a few days later. So they're both long-term and short-term effects.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that uses all the questions in our chat and brings us actually to perfect timing. We had almost everybody stay on the Zoom call today, which always means that people enjoyed the topic. You can always tell.
Wonderful.
So it was really, Dr. Fuller, a real pleasure to have you come visit us today and really talk about an incredibly important topic. And as you know, especially in New York City, and as you know, Mount Sinai sits on the border of the Upper East Side and East and Central Harlem. So real reasons to look at this topic. So thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you for the invitation. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Have a nice day, everybody. See you all soon.